So hello again and welcome to the Journey Beyond Yourself Summit. I am absolutely delighted to be here today with Professor Mark Solms, who is a South African neuropsychologist and psychoanalyst, which I just think is brilliant. The chair of neuropsychology at the University of Cape Town, and the president of the South African Psychoanalytical Association. Is that right, Mark?
In fact, I've just handed over the reins to my successor.
You have. Okay, one less thing on your plate. Professor Solms is joining us today from his office at the hospital, so I'm absolutely delighted that you're sparing us this time. And Professor Solms is also author of The Hidden Spring, The Source of Consciousness, his new book, which I am just loving, Professor Solms. So welcome.
Thank you.
I'm going to take a minute to talk about you. I hope you don't mind. I kind of love everything about you. So I came across Professor Solms on an ABC interview that I happened to have on in my car. I just had the ABC on when I was driving, and I was so taken by you that I arrived at my destination pretty quickly after, and then I sat in the car for the next hour listening to your interview. And I think the thing that gripped me about you is not obviously the topic that you're talking about, and that we're going to talk about here today, which has been my fascination too. But you're also just such a lovely, humble, thoughtful, you obviously got a brilliant mind, but you're also really people-centered, and your compassion comes across when you talk. And I glean this when you were talking in the interview that I heard about your childhood growing up in South Africa and then returning later as an adult to your property and all the interesting predicaments you found yourself having there. And, your honesty and your realness, as well as your genuine care for others, is obvious. So you're a real gem, Professor Solms, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today. And everyone here at the Journey Beyond Yourself Summit is going to just love a glimpse of you and your fascinating work. So I'm going to leave the story of your home in South Africa there. So it's a little tease to our viewers to go and dig deeper into your story, because I want to maximize our time here talking about your research into consciousness. And I know that a little bit of your childhood and stories is probably going to come out today, because I know they're interwoven with your career and the questions that you seek to find answers to in your life. But I want to start off with your book, if that's okay. So the title is The Hidden Spring, and the subtitle is A Journey to the Source of Consciousness. And the trajectory really is a journey that's partly sort of autobiographical too, I think. And you start off talking about your childhood and what tragically happened to your brother, and then the questions that you were left with, and then you took on, and through your scientific career, starting out as a neuropsychologist and studying the brain, in particular the cortex. But the book takes us on a journey from the cortex that we're usually taught about in neuropsychology and neuroscience to the brainstem, to feelings, and then beyond that down to self-organizing systems. We cover thermodynamics and the free energy principle. It's really a deep, deep dive into consciousness and all of its complexity. So I'm going to stop talking and wondering where we should begin with this. So perhaps you would like to surmise the book for us briefly, setting your intention of what your intention was with the book and where you got to, and however that comes across and where you want to start. I'm handing over to you.
Well, thanks very much. You make a very enthusiastic introduction, and that's a delight to see, because really what could be more interesting than this topic. You know, I often ask myself, why does anybody spend their lives studying anything else than the brain?
Yes.
And you know, the magical thing about the brain is that somehow this organ, this thing, you know, is you. You are your brain. Somehow this tissue, these cells, produce your every thought and feeling. You know, so that's what, and as you alluded to, I observed that fact when my brother, when we were little, sustained a brain injury, and I saw how he as a person was changed by it. So, you know, I was confronted at an early age by the fact that we are somehow our brains. But when I went to years later, obviously, when I came to immersing myself in this field and learning what we knew in the 1980s about the brain basis of mental functioning, it was really quite a disappointment, because although we knew a lot and it was impressive about how the cortex processes information along all these multiple, you know, modularized channels, and how somehow this it passes, for example, visual information into face recognition and reading and object recognition and so on. There was no sense of the person, you know, who's doing this reading or this recognizing of faces or this processing of information. And when I asked my professors, you know, in sort of naive, excited sort of questions like we were just talking about, but where's the self? Where's the subject that's perceiving all these objects? They looked at me in a kind of professorial sort of way and said, you know, Solms, you really shouldn't ask questions like that. They're not good for your career. In other words, these weren't the proper scientific questions one is supposed to be pursuing. And for me, that was a great disappointment, because that was really what was interesting about the brain. What I was learning about, interesting as it was, didn't differentiate the brain from anything else. You know, I mean, you can learn about the functional mechanisms of the lung or the, you know, or the stomach or the liver in much the same sort of way. This is how things get processed. But what's utterly unique about the brain is that it feels like something to be a brain. And it was that I was so disappointed to not learn about. And the journey that you refer to is indeed a personal journey of my trying to sort of rectify that omission in neuropsychology, as Oliver Sacks put it in a book that I read at that time, which really impressed me. He said, neuropsychology is admirable, but it excludes the psyche. Neuropsychology excludes the psyche. You know, so the journey that I then went on was trying to bring the psyche back into neuropsychology. That took me far afield. Initially, it took me literally to the other end of the world. I moved to London and trained in psychoanalysis, because for all of its shortcomings, and psychoanalysis has many a shortcoming, but at least it takes the lived life of the mind seriously. You know, the sort of sentient subject, the being of the mind, is what they say, which is one of the reasons why it's such a problematical discipline, because it's not, you know, you can't do objective science on subjective things, or at least that's how it was before we joined these two disciplines together, because that then became my life's ambition, to try to bring this subjective perspective into neuroscience, and to, in so doing, to return the psyche to neuropsychology. Now, there's a long story, but I'll just sort of abbreviate it by saying that the first thing that I discovered was that one of the reasons why there was no sentient person in the functions I was studying is because we were studying cortical functions. And this is based on an historical assumption that the cortex is the organ of the mind. But around that time, when I studied and the years after that, which was the 80s and 90s of the last century, evidence accumulated that the cortex, in fact, can do all of its cognitive information processing without consciousness. In other words, you can, all the things I mentioned a few minutes ago, recognizing faces, objects, reading with comprehension and so on, all of those cognitive functions don't require consciousness. You can demonstrate that experimentally, for example, with a tachistoscope, which flashes information for just a few milliseconds, so that the research participant doesn't know that they've seen anything at all, let alone what it is that they've seen. You can flash words and faces and, and then show from the subsequent behavior of the person that they have joined up those words with those faces. So if the one face says philanthropist, face A, and face B says rapist, even though the person doesn't know they've seen those faces, when asked afterwards which of these two people they prefer, which they believe consciously they've never met before, they choose the face that says philanthropist. So this shows that the cortex can do all of these higher cognitive things without being conscious at all. And so that for me was a first revelation that, no wonder studying of how all of this information gets processed didn't really say much about the being of the person processing the information, because that part of how our brains work doesn't require consciousness to do its thing. That took me down to the brain stem, which is a much more primitive, ancient part of the brain that we share. In fact, in basic outline, the structure of the human brain stem is no different from that of any other vertebrates. But it's in the brain stem that the consciousness arises. People, it seems to make common sense that consciousness flows in with our sensory information processing, but that's not the case. The consciousness is in fact generated in the core of the brain stem, and that has to activate the cortex in order for it to render the cortex conscious. So that we knew already for a few decades, but we had assumed that that was something like the power supply of the cortex. So it's a bit like a television set needs to be plugged in at the wall in order for it to do its thing. But that doesn't mean that the televisual work is actually being done by the power supply. It's just a prerequisite for the television to work. And so what we discovered in the 90s and into the early 2000s is that the brain stem that activates the cortex isn't just a power supply. We were able to show that in fact it has a quality and a content that background arousal of consciousness, and that is feeling. The remarkable thing is that when we think of our consciousness, we think of hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting, touching, all these external sensory modalities, and we think that's what consciousness is made of. And we leave out feelings, which is, really the heart of the matter. And feelings, importantly, are not something about the outside world. They're about you. The feelings are about your reaction to these objects that you see from the outside. So what those findings of the late 90s and early 2000s showed us were two things. The one is that feeling, in other words, raw affects, as we call them in neuropsychology, things like the basic bodily ones like hunger and sleepiness and, and thirst and being too hot and so on, just feeling, but also emotional feelings like fear or fright or sadness or anger. These feelings are generated from the brain stem. And then secondly, since we know that's, as it were, the power supply of the cortex, that demonstrated that the foundation of all consciousness, the prerequisite of all consciousness, is feeling. And I don't know if you want me to summarize what sort of evidence we have for that, because it is such a counterintuitive and unexpected conclusion. But the evidence really is very solid for those two conclusions. Number one, that consciousness in the form of feeling is generated in the brainstem. And number two, that the cortex is not intrinsically conscious. Its consciousness depends upon this much more primitive part of the brainstem. So as I said, if you want me to, I'll tell you the evidence for that. But let me just skip over that to the next point, because you're asking me to summarize the book, which is that feelings, are a much the mechanism for feelings is really much simpler than the mechanism for all of this complicated cognition that we had previously taken to be our starting point in terms of trying to understand how consciousness is generated in the brain. Feelings are regulated by a very basic mechanism called homeostasis. Homeostasis basically, it's the foundational mechanism whereby living things stay alive. We have to occupy certain limited states. So, for example, I mentioned earlier about body temperature. You have to be between 36.5 and 37.5 degrees Celsius. If you go 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees above that or below that, you die. And the same applies to the water and salt level of your body, the sugar level, the oxygen and carbon dioxide, and all of these basic things. You have to stay within a narrow, frighteningly narrow range. And if you deviate from that range, you feel it in the form of an unpleasant feeling. So for example, if you're in a carbon dioxide filled room, you feel suffocation alarm. That's an unpleasant feeling. And if you move in the right direction, you go through the door that leads to more oxygen as opposed to the one that leads to less oxygen, you feel it. You feel, yes, this is the right way to go. Thank God for this, air. And so that's what feeling does. And it's the same with what I've just said about respiratory control. It's the same with all these bodily functions I told you about, like being too thirsty. Having too little water in your body, you start to feel thirsty. Being too hot, you start to feel unpleasantly, and you need to do something. It impels you to do something to get the feeling. So homeostasis works like that. This is bad feelings, you're going the wrong way, and good feelings, pleasurable feelings, say, yep, you're going the right way. And so they guide our choices. Now, there's a lot more I could say about how that then unfolds over higher cognitive controls, but just to stick to the main story, the point is that homeostasis, as I've just explained it, is not very complicated. And so it's possible to reduce to a simple causal mechanism, how homeostasis works and therefore how feelings work. And that for me was, a really, it's the culmination of my life's work to be able to finally realize, hang on, this consciousness, which is such a mysterious and wonderful thing. If you reduce it down to its elemental form, it can be fitted into everything else that we know about how the universe works. And it's a bit sort of deflationary at the same time. You sort of think, oh, I wanted consciousness to remain a complete mystery, but on the other hand, I didn't want it to. And so, that's what brings me to my current, the point that I'm at now, where I'm working with, to my very great surprise, I'm working with physicists and computer scientists and biomedical engineers, because if we really have isolated the causal mechanism whereby feelings are generated, then it must be possible to engineer an artificial form of feeling, frightening and crazy as that sounds. Logically, it's a sort of necessary test of the theory. If you're really going to claim that you have cracked the mechanistic causal way in which consciousness is produced, then you should be able to engineer it. And so, surprised as I am at this stage in my life to be doing that sort of work, that's where I am. So that's a thumbnail sketch of the book, Sally.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. And what I'm probably going to do now is pepper you with some seemingly, simple to me questions that I know you'll be able to answer. But I have to ask the question. We'll jump around a lot, I think. But where you're at now, then, I'm intrigued as a sentient being that feels yourself and a neuropsychologist that knows this logical follow through, that if you really have isolated the causal mechanism of feelings, then you must be able to engineer it. How much of you is hopeful you will find that we've done it, and how much is you have hopeful that there's still a big mystery out there?
If you think about it, it kind of has to be. Consciousness can't exist outside of the known physical universe. That's the sort of crux of the matter. If you think where I started as a child, with this question, how can this organ be me? It is, you are somehow an organ. And so, unless you believe in a disembodied soul or something of the kind, if you take a natural scientific approach to the world, then somehow it must be possible for us to understand how this, how this stuff that we experience, how it's somehow produced by the laws of physics. So in principle, it must be possible. Now, the crucial step in my own trajectory has been to reduce consciousness down to its most basic form. And that's not an unimportant move, because you lose a lot of that mystery in the process of reducing things down to their basic form. You must know that what I'm talking about when I speak of consciousness, of the kind that the brainstem produces, as I mentioned earlier, it's something that all vertebrates have. Therefore, we're talking about something that you and I share with fishes. So the consciousness, that the very, very complicated form of consciousness that is human consciousness, I think that once you start building back up again all of the little ingredients, you do create something much more wonderful than the component parts. So it's not that I wish that it was still a mystery. It's that I don't underestimate the gap between a reductionist scientific explanation of the elemental form of consciousness in the sense of raw feeling and the enormous complexity of the phenomenal world that you and I are experiencing and communicating about right now. I think that we must remember that in putting the thing back together again, there's also a contribution or two that needs to come from disciplines other than reductionist neuroscience. To understand really the life of the mind requires not only things like psychoanalysis, but literature and art and everything about the humanities. That's the way that I would answer that question about the loss of the mystery, or the question as to whether some remains.
Yeah, that's a good answer. And I mean, I'm still fascinated by all this, and I'm sure you'll have a great answer for this. It's far more intelligent than one I could come up with. But all of the reductionism we've managed to do, and the taking apart of the brain and looking at the parts and isolating, we can probe and prod various parts and see what they do now, but we've never still found the picture that we all come up with in our subjective experience of an image. When we're creating a memory, we might be able to find the point of that memory and be able to reactivate the memory, but that process of our experience as having a visual associated with that memory that comes quite naturally. How far are we to finding these kind of links with finding the synapses or the particular areas within the brain that they could be stored, but our experience isn't of a firing of a neuron to another neuron. It's an experience of a rich sensory, visual, or, with all our senses firing and wiring of a memory.
Well, the first thing that we need to bear in mind here is a sort of I don't know if it's a philosophical point, but we must remember that the being of the brain and the observing of it from the outside as an object are two different observational perspectives on one thing. So when you talk about the experience of an image as opposed to the brain mechanisms that generate it, you must remember that you're talking about the same thing looked at from two different points of view. So the experiencing of an image and the looking from the outside at the brain, that's busy generating that image. It's sort of not an ordinary way of thinking. but it's two different perspectives on one thing. So that to look at it from the outside, you think, but how can that be the image? You know, look, that's just a thing. But it's only because you're looking at it from the outside rather than being on the inside of the brain. Now, having said that's slightly a confusing thing, let me say that actually reductionist science has taken us quite far down the route that you were just asking about. For example, it is possible, I'll do this in two stages. It's possible through recording with a cortical, if the skull is open, sometimes with people who need surgery, they're willing to take part in these experiments. So the skull is open, the cortex is exposed, you can put this micro EEG array onto the cortex and you can record while you're speaking to the person, you can record the pattern of activity in their cortex. So you say this word, you say that word, you say the other word, there's a different pattern of activity. Then it's possible afterwards from recording that pattern of activity to generate the word. So from the actual, just the recording in your computer, you can reproduce the sound from those patterns. So even if you weren't there when the thing was recorded, you can afterwards generate, and then you can likewise, without hearing what's being said, looking only at the cortical pattern, you can decipher what that person is hearing. Mm-hmm. So that's quite remarkable, but even more remarkable is in the visual sphere, looking at the occipital lobe, at the visual cortex, it's possible to decipher what the person is seeing. So in other words, the pattern, you must remember the pattern on your retinae, at the back of your eye, they're photosensitive cells there that are then propagating this pattern of images, these little pixels through something called the lateral geniculate body to the visual cortex. And there you just have exactly that pattern projected onto your cortex. So the image is literally there. It's even possible to do that. Recently, a Japanese study showed that it's possible to determine what somebody's dreaming from fMRI images of their visual cortex. You know, the most private personal experience, you know, what you're dreaming. At least in terms of the basic shapes involved, it's possible just from the fMRI to tell what the person was, what images they were seeing. So what I've said is that it's the images that we experience, auditory or visual images, are just patterns of activity in the cortex. Now comes the question, but where am I, the person who's experiencing all of this? And it brings me back to where I began in my summary of my book, that in the brain stem, there are feelings, you know, that you're generating a feeling. I feel like this, and we don't only have good or bad, you know, we have a great multiplicity of different feeling states. And then, so this is the core of the brain, and it works something like, I feel like this about that. And so the sentient consciousness is sort of extended, as it were, or palpates these images, so that it's you that's experiencing these images in your cortex. Maybe I've put it too simply like that, but I'm trying to show it's actually in the end, you know, tractable. That's not that impossible to explain how it happens that you, the subject of your mind, experiences a visual image or an auditory sound. We in rough outline, you know, have the mechanisms of how that happens in the brain.
So if and you know, you do this wonderful job, and I know that we're really simple. Your book is so in-depth and complex, really, and we're doing a very simplified version here. But if consciousness comes down to feelings, and those feelings originate in the brain stem, where does the line between a sentient being begin and end, if you understand me? Because I know, you know, where is an organism that just has it's going to have that drive and that feeling associated with it to survive and respond? Where does that begin as a feeling that we would attribute that sentient consciousness to? And where does it end? Like, I know in the book there's discussion around zombies and, you know, various quotes, but you know, and I know that in the philosophical literature we've had all ideas from all reality is projected to everything is conscious. So where do you land with how do we know, you know, when we get to microorganisms and organisms and even animals, where does the line cross that we would say that's a sentient consciousness now because it has feelings?
Yeah. So, well, let me address this point over a number of steps, starting with the fact that with the cortex, which, as I say, was our big mistake, was to focus on the cortex. The cortex, all of the things that it does, as I said to you earlier, it can do unconsciously. You know, there's all of this cognitive information processing. And the sorts of functions that our cortex performs, your computer can perform too, or even your mobile phone. You know, I mean, obviously at a simpler level, but when it comes to supercomputers, not so much at a simpler level. You know, the computers and phones can perceive and recognize and record information, etc. You know, so this whole business of perception and memory, learning, and even executive, you know, sort of decision-making processes that our computers and our phones do this all the time. So your question about, you know, where does the sentience begin and end? I think that's part of the question. If it's just complicated information processing, then what's the difference between our cortex and a very complicated computer? Why do we assume that the computer is not conscious? And so then I come to the second level. It's, well, if you look at our brains, the cortex is not where the consciousness is coming from. So it's not about the complexity. It's about something else. And you used the word survival in your synopsis there. And this is a crucial difference between you and me and a computer or a mobile phone. We have a goal and a purpose, which is to keep on living. You know, that's the basic design of all living things, is that there's a value system, whether you intellectually endorse it or not. There's a value system built into evolutionary biology, which is that it's good to survive and bad not to. You know, so everything about how we function is at bottom aims at maintaining our survival. And as I said, that comes down to homeostasis, which is this mechanism that's performed by these brainstem nuclei. So we have the beginnings of a scientific grip on this question, because we know, well, these are the brain mechanisms, the brain nuclei that generate this stuff called feeling, which is the basic way in which we, you know, guide our actions so as to not cop it. We can look to see, well, what other creatures have those same structures. And so it's not just a philosophical question. Well, perhaps everything's conscious. Perhaps computers are conscious. Perhaps tables and chairs are conscious. Well, yeah, perhaps. But, you know, well, let's look at it scientifically. We know in us human beings. I told you I could summarize evidence, and I'll just mention one bit of it here. If you stimulate those nuclei in a live conscious human being, as we do in neurosurgery, it generates intense feelings. You can generate the feeling, and they can say, I feel like this when you stimulate there. I feel like that when you stimulate there. So you can literally cause the feelings like that. Now you look to other creatures that have exactly the same hardware. Like fishes, as I said, surprising as it may be, fishes have that same hardware. So then we have a scientific basis for hypothesizing fishes must be conscious because they have the structure which in us causes us to have feelings. But then in science, you have to test predictions that arise from those hypotheses. So, for example, the part of the human brain stem, which when you stimulate it, it causes intensely pleasurable feelings, and the part that when you stimulate it causes intensely unpleasant feelings, you predict if I stimulate that in the fish, it's going to be attracted to the stimulus. And if I stimulate this in the fish, it's going to avoid the stimulus. That's a prediction. And then if that comes to pass, then this is how we do science as opposed to philosophy. Then you say, well, my prediction is confirmed. It seems that I was right. And you don't do just one experiment, you do several. Like, for example, I'll give you just one other one, which was done with zebrafish. The fish are swimming around in a tank. And on this end of the tank, for me, it's the left-hand side. So on this end of the tank, you put food. Then the fish tend to congregate on that side of the tank because that's where the food is. That's called place preference behavior. Then you take other substances and put them on this end of the tank. The substances in question being nicotine, morphine, amphetamine, and cocaine. All of those substances are not good for you. They're not good for you, and they're not good for a zebrafish either. So there's no reason in terms of basic survival mechanisms in and of themselves for the zebrafish to want to go where the cocaine, amphetamine, nicotine, and morphine are, but they do. What they do is they hang around there and then dart back for some food and then hang around here where the drugs are. Why? Because those drugs produce pleasant feelings. That's all that they do. So the only appeal of those drugs is the feeling. It's not nutritional. And so, these are the sort of lines of evidence that then accumulate to lead us to the pretty incontrovertible conclusion, that fishes are conscious. So, then comes the question, well, are all living things conscious? And we have just this empirical handle that, well, if it has a reticular activating system where we know what to stimulate and it behaves according to the way that we predict it will, then we're on reasonably solid ground. Once you start getting to creatures who don't have that hardware, it becomes less certain. It's more difficult to actually know what you're doing. And this is not unimportant. I mean, there are many creatures that look their behavior is highly suggestive of consciousness, like, for example, the octopus, but it doesn't have that same anatomy. So there we start moving into more murky ground, and we have to recognize there's a point beyond which it's harder and harder for us to tell. So I think I would say, certainly anything with the reticular activating system, there's every line of evidence suggests they're conscious. There's some other creatures which have the kinds of behaviors, like, for example, the place preference behavior I just described. An octopus shows that, but we don't know what the brain mechanisms are whereby this happens. But it suggests, well, it also has feelings. But then when you start going down to creatures without a brain, then it starts to become really hard to imagine where the consciousness could be coming from, because the sort of meta-homeostat, the orchestrator of all these different bodily needs, which is what the brain does, that itself isn't there. And also you start seeing that these creatures' behaviors are entirely reflexive. In other words, entirely automatized. There's no choice. And if you think back to what I said earlier about the function of feeling, is to tell you, like I spoke about that carbon dioxide filled room, and I said, where the good feeling is in terms of respiration, tells you what to do, where to go, where not to go. These animals without brains, they don't make choices like that. It's completely predictable. They've just got an automatic stereotyped program in them. When this happens, do that. When you bang into the thing on the right, turn 90 degrees left till you bang into the thing on the left, then turn 90 degrees right, and so on. So, there's, from their behavior also, it starts to look very unlikely, as if they have consciousness. If their consciousness, like ours, is rooted in this basic value system and feelings. So it's not, in science, we never have an absolute truths where we know for certain, that it is a 100% definite that this animal's conscious and this one's not. But the weight of the evidence is very, very strong for vertebrates being conscious, all of them. And then it slowly becomes less and less certain for other creatures with brains, until by the time you get to creatures without brains, I think there's no There's no reasonable grounds for thinking that they are conscious, let alone non-living things. You know, when I say let alone non-living things, remember where we started. I spoke of computers and mobile phones. I think there's no fathomable reason to believe that non-living things are conscious. And if I may just sum up again, remember, it all starts with that value system, that living things, you know, that they're trying to achieve something. They have goals and purpose, which is to survive. This is the wellspring of not only of life, but of consciousness too.
Fascinating. So I'm intrigued. I know that there's many case studies that you scatter through the book and that your research has been based on. Are there any case studies in history with a human subject with a damaged brainstem, or the area that the feelings arise from, with a damaged that area? So is it the reticular activating system? Are there any case systems where that's been damaged? Because that would be fascinating. Do they still feel? You know, because obviously they're still conscious.
Yeah. So I'll come at this from two ends. At the one end, the cortical end, I must tell you that there are many human patients who are born without cortex, with no cortex at all. Yeah. There's a condition called hydranencephaly. And these children are conscious by every measure. You know, they wake up in the morning, they go to sleep at night. Some of them have absence seizures, they lose consciousness and they regain consciousness. Even their parents can tell, you know, she's with the fairies and she's back again. But much more interestingly than that, they show emotional reactivity. They respond emotionally appropriately to, you know, if you bang your hands, they get a fright. If you place a cuddly thing on their laps, they like it. If you tickle them, they like it. If you frustrate them, they arch their backs and get angry and so on. So what that shows is that the brain stem alone can generate all these basic emotional states. It doesn't need any cortex. Cortex totally missing in those children. By coming at it from the other end, which is the end you're asking about, if you damage the reticular activating system, the smallest lesion that's necessary to obliterate all consciousness is a 2 cubic millimeter area of damage in something called the parabrachial complex. So just that's the size of a match head. So cortex, you can have none of it and you're conscious. Take 2 cubic millimeters of parabrachial complex and you've got, you know, you're in a coma. So your question about if there's damage there, you know, what does it do to feelings? The first answer is, well, it obliterates feelings, which means it obliterates consciousness, which means the patient is in a coma. But then there's all sorts of complexity around that. I have to say that, I mean, I'm trying to not be too technical. So I keep speaking of the reticular activating system as if it alone generates all consciousness. There are other structures closely interdigitated with it. In the brainstem, the single most important other structure is called the periaqueductal gray, which just means the gray tissue around the canal. So we call it the PAG for short. This is also really important for consciousness. If that's damaged, the patient is not in a coma, but rather in what's called non-responsive wakefulness. It's also called the vegetative state, which is a kind of a horrible word, where the person is conscious, they wake up and go to sleep, but they don't show anything of what you saw in those kids. No emotional reactivity and also no spontaneous intentionality of their own. So these kids obviously do have that because their periaqueductal gray is intact. If you stimulate those structures, you can generate various different emotions predictably. You know, very roughly, if you stimulate the front part of the PAG, it generates roughly very pleasant feelings of various kinds. If you stimulate the back part of it, much less pleasant feelings of various kinds. So that's stimulation, but you're asking about damage. So if you go a little bit higher, because those patients mostly, they're in these very their consciousness is either absent or very degraded. So it's not you can't really talk to them about how you're feeling. Only the normal subjects who we stimulate, you can talk to them. But patients with damage there, they're in no position really to be talking to us. But higher parts of the same system, like for example, the basal forebrain nuclei, which are also arousal structures. They're responsible for one of the neuromodulators called acetylcholine. I report in my book a patient of my own who had damage there. And there you see much more interesting things than you see in the patients with the damage in those core concentrated consciousness generating nuclei. This patient, he was in a state of you can only call it a dream-like state. He's not remembering, he's not in control of his own mental processes, but he's perfectly conscious. And he just sort of like, there's a word that we use, confabulation. He sort of like makes things up. This is what I mean by in a dreamlike state. He's living in a world that isn't there, but he thinks, this is happening and that's happening. None of these things are really happening. And I studied a number of these patients very closely. And what we were able to discern eventually is that these delusions or confabulations that these patients are living in actually construe everything in their favor, so that they constantly believe things which patently aren't true, but which make things better for them. Like, for example, this patient that I reported, he had the damage to his basal forebrain nuclei was due to an operation, a brain operation, which had gone wrong. So he said he conceded that he'd had an operation, but the operation that he said he'd had was dental implants, which, as it happens, he had dental implants, and that had gone right. Also, he said he'd had a pacemaker fitted to his heart, which he had years ago, and that too had been a successful operation. So his invented reality was, yes, I've had an operation, it's implants and they work fine. Yes, I've had an operation, it's a pacemaker and it works fine. And then likewise, he would say, yes, of course, something's happened to my head. I was playing rugby, I had a blow to my head, but the physician, the sports physician said, I can play on, I'm fine. And so everything that this confused state of mind, as it looks like from the outside, it's just confusion. When you actually study the content of it, you see that what he's doing is sort of like revising reality so as to make it more pleasant. And so there you get a sense of what the basal forebrain, this part of that arousal system, it's particularly important for detecting where things are not going as expected. Which is an unpleasant thing. None of us like things to not be the way that we want them to be. So with this guy, you see that aspect of he's in a way living in too pleasant a world. He makes everything too pleasant for himself, which sadly, I wish we could all live like that, but sadly it ends in tears. You have to recognize where things are not going the way that you want them to in order to adjust to them. So I'm giving you a very long-winded answer I mean, I could elaborate different parts of these arousal structures arising from the brainstem in what we call limbic circuits. They're responsible for different aspects of emotionality. And when they're damaged, we lose those aspects. And when they're stimulated, you can generate those aspects as it were artificially.
Fascinating. Thank you for all that. And you've made me think of a few free associations as you were talking, and mainly to do with working in psychiatric wards and seeing various patients. When you were talking earlier, I was thinking about catatonic schizophrenia. Is that the same kind of state, a catatonic state where you're conscious but you're not conscious? It's very similar to what I was describing, the so-called vegetative state or non-responsive wakefulness. It's a lower level version of what you see in catatonia. Arising from, again, in the reticular activating system, there's a nucleus called the ventral tegmental area. It's not really a nucleus, it's a clump of cells. And from that arises something called the mesocortical mesolimbic dopamine circuit. And this dopamine circuit, it's got various names. Some people call it the
brain reward system. Some people call it the seeking system. Some call it the wanting system. You get the sort of, if you aggregate those different words, you get a sense of what this is. It's a kind of all-purpose positive motivational circuit, driven mainly by dopamine. And although we don't by any means understand all the brain mechanisms of schizophrenia, what we do know is that all psychotic states, I mean, I'm not speaking about psychedelic artificial psychoses. I mean the core psychotic illnesses that we deal with. Overactivation of that system, overactivity in that system creates psychosis. And we do it when we treat Parkinson's disease, for example, where we give dopamine in various forms. You can accidentally induce a psychosis, so it's a very well understood mechanism, this. Now, the point I'm leading up to is that when that system is shut down, then you get these abulic, adynamic, akinetic sort of states like catatonia. So it's the same system, either upregulated or downregulated excessively. What you see in those patients, whether they be neurological or psychiatric, when you're dealing with that system, whether it's functionally impaired or structurally damaged, is they lack initiative. They lack the spontaneous impulse to do things. They can follow instructions up to a point. You can say sit down, stand up, turn left. It's not as if they're paralyzed or comatose. It's just that they lack spontaneity, initiative, the sort of oomph that makes life worth living or makes us want to do stuff. And it's very interesting if you think about it biologically. It makes good sense that there should be a system in the brain which makes you want to do stuff, makes you interested in the world and interact with the world, because that's where everything is that you need. So to have a mechanism that makes you engage with the world, explore the world, curious about the world, interested in the world, is probably a good biological idea to have such a thing.
Yeah, and it must be fascinating for you to come at all of this with your two branches, one of this deep understanding of the physiology of the brain, and two, with your study of psychoanalysis. And when you were talking, we probably don't have time to go into this here, but thinking of the impact of trauma and how that would affect it structurally and biologically, but also then the psychic aspect of that, because of course it makes sense to then protect yourself of a trauma. And in the example you gave of the guy who'd experienced a brain surgery that went wrong, there's kind of all those psychological issues you can imagine that would come into play of not wanting to go there too, which I know would then have the flow-on effect for impacting the neuro transmitter circuits and the actual biology of the brain, which is fascinating. But I want to ask you one specific question, because it's always interesting, isn't it, to turn it back to how we can use all this information to help people. And when you were talking earlier about the stimulation of the brainstem, specific areas of the reticular activating system, and we can bring on positive emotions, positive effect, and negative emotions. And we know there's a good example in the book of the case study where that lady went into instant chronic depression symptoms, really, and experiencing that awful no will to live, essentially, by stimulation. Is there any there must be research being done and technological advances being done to help people with depression by means of stimulation, some kind of external or not too invasive implant or even external device that's going to give them that stimulation instead of, I know that we internally take things to impact the neurotransmitter system and the dopamine system and the serotonin and all of that. But is there a way to actually treat people with some stimulation?
Well, I want to say two things about this. First of all, yes, there is. At the most basic level, the periaqueductal gray that I spoke about earlier, it's well established that to stimulate this for the treatment of chronic pain. Now we're talking about pain, which is different from higher emotional states of the kind that you're talking about. But those two, there's good evidence. For example, Helen Mayberg has for several years now shown with chronic treatment refractory depressed patients, and it's only ethically permissible to do these studies on patients in whom every form of treatment has not worked for many years. Then they are assessed by her team. She's a neurologist. At that time, when I first met her, she was at Emory University, and she stimulated, or the surgeon that she worked with stimulated just under this, what's called the subgenual cingular gyrus, in the white matter just under there. And on the operating table, these patients feel better. I mean, within seconds, they feel better. That's the part of the anterior thalamic radiation. It's part of the separation distress system of the mammal brain. It has to do with panicky feelings, the feeling of separation and loss. Deeper down in that same system, in the dopamine part of it, Volker Kernen, when I was working with him, he was in Freiburg. I'm not sure where he is now, somewhere in Germany. He stimulated, well, first of all, the nucleus accumbens, but then he stimulated the medial forebrain bundle itself, that dopamine circuit that I spoke about. And again, on the operating table, in subtly different ways from Mayberg's. Mayberg's patients say, gosh, you know, you guys are really trying to help me. Thank you so much. You're such good people. And they sort of suddenly feel connected to the world, and they feel that there's a goodness in, you know, that there's something to be had from human relationships, and that people do actually care about them, and, you know, and so on. Whereas Kernan's patients, it's more of a kind of an enthusiasm that they get. So I just, you know, this summer, I think I'm going to go, well, this was before COVID, but, you know, this summer, I think I'll go on a holiday to the Caribbean or something. And so you really do, I mean, I'm speaking about within seconds, you know, within seconds, the patient's mood changes. Now, I said I want to say two things about this. The one is what I've just said. Yes, proof of concept is there that you can alter the mood of very treatment refractory, chronic, burnt out, depressed patients by these techniques. And I say proof of concept, in other words, which is, I think, what underlies your question. You know, can we help people? This knowledge that we're gaining of the brain mechanisms of feelings, you know, that does this lead to new treatments? Of course it does, and of course it will. But the second thing that I wanted to say is that we must also not fall into the trap of thinking because you can alter the feeling by stimulating a particular brain region, which in principle is not that different from saying you can alter a feeling by giving a drug which alters the neurotransmitters in that same system, which is exactly what we do. And we mustn't lose sight of the fact that that's symptomatic treatment. The fact that you can make the person feel better by improving their dopamine levels doesn't mean that the illness is one of too little dopamine. Do you understand what I mean? The feeling, if I can put it in this way, feelings mean something. You know, so for example, if you let me take it down to the simplest of feelings. You know, if you're thirsty, it means you need water. If you're hungry, it means you need food. And when it comes to emotions, you know, if you feel fear, it means you're in danger. If you feel separation distress, it means, you know, you've become separated from your caregiver. Those feelings are there for a reason, is what I'm saying. And so you don't, if you take away the feeling, you haven't taken away the cause. So if somebody feels chronically panicky or chronically sad, this feeling means that, you know, our need for companionship and love and to be wanted and thought about and kept in mind, our need for that isn't being met. So treating the feeling won't actually fix the underlying problem. If I can put it in a, I mean, it's not to say that symptomatic treatment isn't important. I mean, God knows if you're suffering, you know, you want your symptoms removed, but I'm just warning that that isn't curing the disease. So it's if I can use a really overly crude analogy, if you suffer angina in other words, chest pain after exercise, and you go to a cardiologist and say, I've got a pain in my chest, and they give you a painkiller, I don't think they would be doing you a great service, because what that feeling of pain in the chest means is that your heart muscle is not getting sufficient blood supply. And so you need to treat that. And the same, I know I'm being very simple about it, but I want to get the point across. The same applies in psychiatry. It's a great mistake to just treat symptoms and not understand that they mean something. Yes. So that's in a way what you referred to, the fact that I trained first in one of the neurosciences and then second in psychoanalysis. It's precisely, that I think we owe our patients both. We need the best scientific understanding of the brain mechanisms involved, but we must also not lose sight of everything that, all the commonsensical things that we've learned. If somebody says to you, I feel terrible, you don't say, well, here's a pill. You say, why? What happened, dear? Can I help? We mustn't lose sight of that aspect of mental life as we make all of this dramatic progress technologically.
Yes, perfect. I'm so glad you said that. Perfect. So that brings me to asking you this question. As you were talking then, there was I was thinking of your own story. And I know that you probably went into the area that you're in because your brother Lee had that awful accident and you observed him coming back physically the same, but he wasn't there. So of course that sparked you off onto what makes us who we are. Where in the brain is Lee? Where in the brain are us? I also know that you have spoken about experiencing depression yourself because as a result of that, because you made that conclusion that if we are just a part of the brain, what is the point of it all? So I'd love to know on the journey, because you were 4 when Lee had his accident, you've had a long career, and you've got a long career ahead of you, but in where you've come to so far, how, because I feel like you had a drive to answer your own questions biologically, mechanically, but also more than that, what's the point of it all? So the question is, have you found the answers that you set out to seek?
Yeah, the basic question that I set out to answer was my own childhood depression, which you're quite right, there's no other word for it than it was a kind of nihilistic despair where I just thought, not at 4, but as the years passed, it was as it sank in, my understanding of everything that flowed from that tragedy and its implications, its knock-on effects. For me, it was, if we are just our brains, a bodily organ, and our bodily organs are mortal things, then we are going to, we're going to have this brief period of biological existence, and then we're gone forever. And so that was really the at bottom. I mean, there was plenty to be depressed about, but that for me was the most depressing thing. It's like, well, what the hell is the point of doing anything? Because it's all going to end, in nothingness, as far as you're concerned, as far as I'm concerned, as far as, our sentient being is going to disappear and then never come back again. And so for me, the only thing worth doing in those circumstances was to, well, let's try and understand what sentient being is. What is this thing that I so cherish, that I am? The possibility of understanding what it is was the only thing that I thought was worth doing, and the only thing that held out any kind of hope of being able to break out of that sort of nihilistic bubble, that I found myself in. So certainly to my own satisfaction, not that I've solved every last problem that there is about sentient being, but at least in terms of the basic question of what is it, where does it come from, how does it work, to my own satisfaction, I think I'm more or less where I was trying to go. But along the way, I've learned a lot of things, both by because I ended up training in psychoanalysis for the reasons that I told you, I learned, the limits of what we can know about ourselves. I became more kind of, I think I got a greater humility about how much can one really understand, even about one's own self, let alone about the human mind in general and so on. There's so much that we don't know about what motivates each and every one of us every day. So I got a kind of a sense of comfort of, well, I'm floating on this thing that's living through me more than, I'm less in control of it than I thought I was. But then from a neuroscientific point of view, if I can just end my answer like this, as I understood, you must know it's not just consciousness is feeling. It's not one thing. There's a multiplicity of feelings, and it's really interesting and really important and really valuable to oneself to learn what are the basic types of emotional feeling in the human brain. Because behind those feelings, remember I said feelings mean something. Behind those feelings is learning, what do we need? What are our emotional needs? And that has been very edifying to learn. I've spoken about survival, things like hunger and thirst, and those aren't emotions. I spoke about things like fear and rage. Those are emotions. The homeostatic settling point is I should not be in danger. I'm in danger. That's fear. I should not have frustrating obstacles impeding me from getting what I want. There is one. That's anger. That's how emotions work. But among those basic emotions are care. That's one of them. Mammals have built into their brains a need to care, a nurturant drive. That's really important for us as a species to understand. We also, apart from the other pleasurable emotions like lust and so on, which are rather selfish, these attachment bonds, which come together with lust in romantic relationships. It's important for us to recognize that we need to attach, we need to be attached to, and the most interesting of all of those basic emotions in the brain is play. Mammals need to play. It's such a wonderful surprise to learn we need to play. We need it. If you deprive a juvenile mammal of half an hour's play today, it'll try to make it up with half an hour's more play tomorrow. And as we've understood why, because it's such a surprise, why do we need to play? Well, what on earth could that have to do with survival? It's not even real. It's play. But as we understood more about the brain mechanisms of play and what it's there for, it's a wonderfully pro-social emotion. In order to keep the fun of playing, children love to play. Why? Because it's fun. But when you try and understand scientifically, why is it fun? Why is there so much pleasure attached to playing? We learn that it's all about reciprocity, mutuality, turn-taking. In order to keep the play episode going, you can't dominate it too much. You can't say, I'm going to play cops and robbers. I'm the cop. You're the robber. There you are, locked in jail. There's no fun for for your playmate in that. So you have to take account of, is this fun for the other person? What are they getting out of this? And so this, I'm just giving you one instance of play leads to empathy. We have to take account of each other's needs. What's in it for, for both of us? And so, this has been a byproduct of this journey of understanding brain mechanisms of feeling and learning what feelings are all about. It really, it's kind of heartening to recognize that we have these needs, these social needs, pro-social needs, attachment needs, empathy and altruism and so on is not something that has to be imposed on us by some religious order. It really, it probably is the other way around, that these religious orders recognize something that we all too easily lose sight of, that it's not all just dog eat dog, so that's the sort of thing that I've learned along that way, which has made it very worthwhile.
Yes, wonderful. Because I wanted to end asking you, what of everything you learned, what would you, profess, what would you suggest is going to help people the most in life? And this summit's all about expanding beyond your limits. Would it be that simply play and socializing and one another and embracing and, interacting, do it because it's good for your brain as well as your species? Or is there something else you'd like to leave us with?
Well, if I have to leave us with one general point, I'd say from a scientific point of view or from a medical point of view, the single most important thing is for us to recognize, that we are both subjects and objects. And that sounds like something very trivial, but too much, like in neurology, our patients are treated as bodies. They're only objects. We don't take account of what is it like to have a brain injury? What is it like to have a brain tumor? What does it feel like? What does it do to your life? We don't really take care of our neurological patients psychologically. And conversely, there's too much in psychology and psychotherapy and psychoanalysis and so on. There's not enough science there. We've got tools for us to be able to really understand, as our conversation today has touched upon, to really understand in important ways, how the mind and how feelings work. And so, we should to have an integrated approach to mental health, which takes account of both sides of the story, so our patients don't get shunted into the one category or the other. But if I can end on a more personal note, I'll tell you what I told my children when they were young. They're in their 20s now, but when they were young, I said to them, here's my philosophy in life. Two things. Number one, you've got to face the facts, especially the unwelcome facts. Those are the ones that we don't want to face because they're there. If you don't face facts that are there, then they're going to surprise you when you least want them to, because you haven't taken account of them. So you've got to face the facts, and just take it on. Yep, I wish it wasn't like that, but it's like that. Then I can deal with it. But I said to my children, but life isn't only about dealing with all of life's problems. You've got to have fun along the way. You've got to enjoy yourself. And so if I have to have a parting shot, I would say that to our audience. We've got to face the facts, my dear fellow human beings, but come on, let's also have fun. Let's enjoy ourselves in the process.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I wish I could talk to you for days longer. You're absolutely fascinating. I have so many more things I want to ask you, but I'm aware of your time and you're doing great work there in the hospital too, so I don't want to keep you from your patients and your students. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thanks, Ali. Great to meet you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.